Katharine is one of the most accomplished atmospheric scientists working on climate change today. She's the principal author of the second, third, and fourth U.S. National Climate Assessment. She was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most important people in the world, I believe in 2016. So we're part of this interesting club. She also is the founder and CEO of a research organization, Atmos, is that how it's pronounced? Which advises many different kinds of organizations, both governmental and nonprofit organizations, on the implications of climate change. And most importantly, she is a voice for how faith and science can come together and be part of the solution. And we're so deeply grateful that she was able to squeeze time out of her schedule to be with us today and to inspire us to be part of the solution that I think all of us can contribute to. So, Katharine, it's really a deep honor for us to have you here and to welcome you back to Madison.
While I lived in the Midwest, in Indiana and Illinois, I also attended an evangelical free church. And of course, this facility is hosted by an E-Free Church. And so I feel like many aspects of my life are coming together here tonight. And the topic that we're talking about, the intersection of science and faith, this is really the perfect place to talk about it. So what I'm going to do, you're going to be part of the discussion too. I want you to actually take out your phone. Yes, you can take it out. Take the opportunity to turn the ringer off. If you have a laptop, you can use the laptop instead. And on your phone, I want you to go to pollev.com/Texas Tech. That's because that's the institution I'm at, and I do not want to hear any basketball jokes, just sympathy. So go to pollev.com, and it will ask you a name, but you do not have to put a name in, just click through. And when you do, I'm going to ask you some questions. So the first question is very easy. Tell me, are you here because of your affiliation with the university, primarily, your affiliation primarily with your church, or because you're an interested community member? Last time I was here, I did this just informally by raising hands, and I was here to speak at an environmental film festival, and so I also spoke here at the same time. And it was really cool because the room was about a third the film festival, a third fellow colleagues and scientists, and a third people from the church. So it was a really interesting mix. It looks like tonight we're predominantly community members, affiliation with the university, and some with church. All right. Now, yeah, okay. I'll give you a minute. There you go. So, speaking of science and faith, since the time of Galileo, we've been told that science and faith are in conflict. And I'm often asked when I do interviews, people often ask me, wasn't your faith challenged by some of the science that you learned? But I grew up in a Christian home, and I grew up with a dad who was a science teacher. So I grew up with a perspective that I didn't realize was so unusual at the time, the perspective that if we truly believe that God created this incredible universe that we live in, then what is science other than trying to figure out how to put it together in the first place? So if the Bible, which we believe is God's written word, somehow appears to conflict with the science, which we believe is God's expressed word, it must be because our understanding is at fault. Somehow we don't know enough about the science, or we are not interpreting it correctly, or we're misunderstanding or not interpreting the Bible correctly. Rather than coming at it from the perspective of there must be something wrong with the science, or there must be something wrong with the faith. When I was at a different university a year or two ago, I was giving a talk, and I was meeting with a lot of early career women scientists, which I love to do as a female scientist myself who never had a female mentor. But I was surprised to learn that our lunch was being cut short because the dean wanted to meet with me. I didn't know him. He wasn't from my field. Before I knew it, the women were being pushed out the door, and the dean was coming in to meet with me. So he sat down, and we introduced ourselves, and he leaned across the table to me, and he said, "I used to be an evangelical." So I asked the obvious question. I said, "Why are you no longer?" And he said, it wasn't anything in science. It wasn't anything in the Bible. I just couldn't reconcile what Christians say they believe with the way they act. And I have to say, somebody did not turn off the ringer. And I have to say that I've never been challenged, my faith has never been challenged by anything I've seen in science. But my faith in the work of God in this world has been challenged by some of the behavior that I've seen from other people who profess to believe that we are to love others as we've been loved by God, yet can somehow find it in themselves to say the most hateful things to other people and to despise people because people look different, or they act different, or they say different things. So when we talk about science and faith, and just for the record with Galileo, you may know this story, but Jesuit astronomers are famous for centuries. They've been well known for being at the very cutting edge of astronomy and astrophysics. So when Galileo was announcing some of these things, many Jesuit astronomers were actually on his side, and they're like, yes, we know you're right. Just don't be so public about it. But Galileo liked to be public about it. So since that day, there's been a very common perception that science and faith are in conflict. And these perceptions are all over the place. If you look for cartoons, if you look for science and faith, you see things like this. This cartoon is about how public school education fosters a disbelief in the Bible. We focus a lot on origins, issues of origin and the age of the earth in the conflict that we see and that we hear, but increasingly over the last 10 years or so, climate has joined the mix. A sign of the Salvation Army Church, on Judgment Day you will meet Father God, not Mother Earth. On Earth Day ad on TV, Earth stands for eliminating all references to Him being God. This idea that science is an alternate religion and that you must choose between faith in God and faith in science is being deliberately fostered as a very intelligent way to get people to reject the science of climate change. Let me give you some examples of politicians who are fostering this. A representative from California. The climate of the globe has been fluctuating. Now, this is the most common argument I hear. It's just a natural cycle. It's been warmer before. But what is he doing here? It's been fluctuating since when? Since God created it. From Florida, our climate will continue to change because of the way God formed the earth. So in other words, very clearly, if you are a Christian and you believe God formed the earth, then you cannot believe that climate change is made by people. In Texas, we're a little bit more concise and direct. Climate change is not a science, it's a religion. Just straight out, no beating around the bush. So you have to pick. Are you going to go with climate change religion, or are you going to go with Christian religion? The problem is that it's Al Gore's fault. Al Gore is the one that turned this into a religion. Yes, these are all real quotes. You can look them up. And the evidence is there because when you Google Al Gore and church, this is what comes up. And you'll notice that one enterprising person actually photoshopped my head onto the choir. Yes. Now, this perception that climate science is a religion is very strong and very powerful because, as Richie alluded to, as the Dalai Lama told him, the vast majority of us in the United States and around the world, we already have a faith, tradition, an affiliation, or a religion, so we are not looking for another one. So if you cast this as a religion, what do people do? We say, oh, that's a false prophet. We know what to do. We reject what they have to say. So it's casting or framing this in some very well-trodden pathways that take advantage of our pre-existing understanding, beliefs, and biases. This is so frequent that today, I was one of a number of scientists around the world who wrote a letter in support of the children who are striking for climate. It was published today in Science magazine. Greta Thunberg thanked us for writing the letter, which was awesome. So here she says, quotes from the letter and thanks us. Now look at this response. Ready? This exquisite collection of climate Scientologists is brought to you by Greta. What are they doing? They're saying it's a religion. So often the conflict model is one of the ones that's most frequently presented to us, that you have to pick. You cannot go with both. You have to choose one or the other. And if you go with science, you are deliberately rejecting your faith. Who are some primary proponents of this besides commentators on Twitter and politicians? Well, on the science side, one of the main proponents of the conflict model is Richard Dawkins, the author of The Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, and many other books. In fact, speaking personally as a scientist and a Christian, I would say he has actually tried to turn science into a religion, scientism rather than science. And balanced on the other side, we have people like Ken Ham, who runs Answers in Genesis. Both of these have invested in turning this into a conflict. They actually actively stoke the flames of conflict and go out of their way to look for it. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. When we talk to people of faith, there's often a perception that it isn't just Richard Dawkins, it's all the scientists in the world. That's the perception. That it's all the scientists in the world who are actively stoking the flames on the conflict model. But then the interesting thing is, in my own personal experience, having had thousands of conversations with colleagues and fellow scientists who do not share my faith, and thousands of conversations and exchanges with people who do share my faith but don't agree on climate change, in my personal experience, much more of the effort and engagement to stoke the flames of the conflict model actually comes from the church. In fact, in terms of the interactions I have received, I would put it at about 999 to 1. Now, that's just my personal experience. It's got a data sample of about 3,000 to 4,000. But I'm not a social scientist. And so that's why I was so fascinated to meet Elaine Eklund, who is a sociologist. So she studies people. In fact, I feel a little bit like a lab rat sometimes around Elaine because she studies scientists. Elaine was at her church, a Presbyterian church, one day some years ago, and during the time when you stand up and you shake people's hands, she was chatting with the woman in front of her, and apropos of the discussion they were having, the woman turned to Elaine and said, "Well, you know those scientists, they're all atheists." And Elaine, being a sociologist, thought, I wonder if they are. Why don't we test that? So she interviewed almost 1,700 natural and social scientists at Research One universities about their views on religion, spirituality, and ethics, and here's what she found. 50% of scientists identify with a very specific religious label. I am a Christian, I am a Muslim, I am Jewish. 76% of people in scientific professions do. So in other words, people who are in engineering or healthcare professions or some type of science application in the real world outside academia. Well, that's not the stereotype we have, is it? She furthermore found that 70% of us scientists consider ourselves to be spiritual people. So 20% prefer not to put a label on it, but they very much think that there's more to life than what science can observe. 70% of scientists. And what she said was most interesting was that 20% of the atheist scientists, so the remaining 30%, they consider themselves to be spiritual atheists. In other words, there is more. It's not God, but there is something. So this completely blows out of the water the stereotype that, frankly, is perpetuated within the Christian church, that it's every single scientist against the church. It's actually 50 to 70% of scientists are on board with faith. So then Elaine asked the question, why do Americans, and I'm sorry to say this is a very American phenomena. It's not unheard of in other countries, but it is overwhelmingly popular in the United States. So Elaine asked, why do Americans still think scientists are hostile to religion? And she interviewed people individually. And what she found is that within their faith communities, religious scientists often practice a secret science. They're hesitant to discuss scientific ideas because they're afraid of offending the other people in their church. Elaine didn't stop there. She then decided she was going to flip the study, and she was going to study Christians. And the way this article wrote it up was so good that I'm just going to quote from the article. The sociologist, Elaine, who busted myths last year with her study finding that the majority of scientists are religious, is at it again. Now she found that 70% of self-identified evangelicals do not view science and religion as being in conflict. Now that's not the stereotype either, is it? Isn't this interesting? But we're so controlled by this stereotype that it's infiltrated every aspect of our public dialogue. From the casual chat we have with the person in front of us at church, to talking to our colleague, to what our politicians say in the media. So a second model to think about science and faith is not the conflict model, it's the separation model. And this is an idea that was originally conceptualized by Stephen Jay Gould. He talked specifically about how science and faith are non-overlapping magisteria, and where he got that word from was he actually got it from the writings of Pope Pius XII. In 1950, he published an encyclical. His encyclical was called Humani Generis, excuse my Latin accent. And in that, he talked about magisteria. And so the way that Stephen Jay Gould described it is, he said, science tries to document the factual character of the natural world. Religion operates in an equally important but utterly different realm of meanings and values, subjects where science could illuminate but never resolve. And he concluded that these do not overlap, and then there's probably some other stuff that doesn't even fit into these two. Now, the interesting thing was that after he introduced this concept of NOMA, as they call it, the US National Academy of Sciences published a report where they picked it up. So in 1999, the Academy of Sciences published a report that said, scientists, like many others, are touched with awe at the order and complexity of nature. And, previewing Elaine's work, they said, indeed, many scientists are deeply religious. But science and religion occupy two different separate realms of human experience, and demanding that they be combined detracts from the glory of each. I didn't even know that the National Academy of Sciences said this until I started to prepare this talk. I love that quote. Now, turning to the Bible, there's a chapter in Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about faith or belief, and it begins with a definition of faith. Faith is the substance of things that we hope for, in other words, that have not come to pass, the evidence of things that are not seen. Now, if I had been around back when the author of Hebrews was writing this, I would have jogged their elbow and I would have said, you forgot the second half of the verse. The second half is obviously, science is the substance of things here and now, the evidence of things that we can observe, right? If we go to the arbiter of modern opinion, Google gives us actually pretty much the same definition. Science is a systematic study of the physical and natural world through observing and experimenting. Whereas faith is a strong belief that is based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. So both science and faith seems to support this idea of separation, that they have different domains or magisteria, different purposes and different roles. And when we confuse those roles, that's where it gets messy. when people say, I don't believe in global warming, as if this horse could somehow say, I don't believe in gravity, and he wouldn't fall off the cliff. But many have not been satisfied with even the idea of separate, non-overlapping domains. And so there's a third model of science and faith that has been proposed that's called the complementary or the fusion model, where they actually are not just separate, they complement each other. Who supports this complementary model or a fusion model? Well, many, many scientists actually support this, going all the way back to people like Isaac Newton and Michael Faraday, through today to Francis Collins, who heads the National Institute of Health. And on the faith side, it's really too many to note. I just had to pick a couple of examples. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop or Bishop of Canterbury. Kathleen Jeffers Schultz, is it? The former Episcopal Bishop. Tim Keller, a well-known evangelical pastor in New York who co-founded BioLogos with Francis Collins. The National Association of Evangelicals that wrote a report about how climate change affects the poor 8 years ago. What does the complementary model suggest? It suggests that they are not in competition, first of all. They're not in conflict. They're not two alternate systems of belief that you have to pick one or the other of. But I would go further and I would describe this as it's a model that shows that in some cases, especially when science confronts us with difficult, tricky, thorny, challenging decisions, that's where we need them both. An analogy that I have heard, which I think is useful, is that science is like a map. It can tell you which way is north and south and east and west. But how do you know which way is the right way to go? For that, you need directions, or in the old days, a compass. The faith is like a compass, telling you where you want to go on that map. So let me ask you, I've proposed what I think. Let me ask you this, and listen carefully to the question. Which model, the conflict model, the separation model, or the fusion model, do you think most people would say is true? Not you, but if you just went out and surveyed people, what do you think people would answer? Okay, so about 50% separation, about 30% conflict, and then about 15% fusion. Interesting. I don't know the answer, by the way. I'm just asking you. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, okay? The slightly different question is, which model do you think is true? Oh, wow, I was very convincing. Uh-huh. And just a reassurance, this is 100% anonymous. So whatever you put up there will not be traced to you in any way, shape, or form. That's why I love this polling. It's really fun to see what people are thinking. All right, so I am very firmly myself in the fusion camp. In fact, the reason why I am a climate scientist is because I'm a Christian. I was planning on studying astrophysics because I think it is amazing that using nothing more than our brains and the technology that we can build on this really insignificant planet, that we can study what is happening at the other side of the universe. We can look back in time. We can study the formation of galaxies. We can look at supernova that exploded millions of years ago, yet the light just reached us today. And so I was planning to study astrophysics when I had to take an extra course to finish my degree. And I'd already taken a minor in Spanish. I'd already taken children's literature. I'd already, at that point, my only choice was really between geology and this new course on climate science. And for those of you in our field of atmospheric science, it was taught by somebody who had just gotten back the previous year from a postdoc at NCAR with Steve Schneider. So Danny Harvey was on fire because Steve is one of the greats in our field, and you just had to be around him for a few minutes and you'd be absolutely inspired and impassioned about this field of climate change. So I ended up in this class that was taught by somebody who had just come back from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where he had just been totally lit on fire by learning under one of the greats in our field how important climate change was. And here I just kind of wandered into this class by accident, and I'm completely shocked to realize, first of all, that climate science is the very same physics that I've been using that explains the universe, of course. But the second thing that shocked me is that climate change is not just an environmental issue. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It's a humanitarian issue. It exacerbates poverty and disease and lack of access to clean water and political instability and strife. And when I heard that, that didn't affect my head, that affected my heart. Because when I was 9 years old, I think I have some pictures here to show you. When I was 9 years old, my parents packed up the family and moved us down to Colombia. That's me in those pictures. And living there, having friends that lived in homes that were made of mud bricks or tied cardboard boxes, friends who lived on the side of a mountain such that when the rains come, they're washed away and there's massive devastation. And then realizing that this is the exact type of catastrophe that climate change is making worse, my heart was what told me, how can I not study climate science? So I am what I am because of my faith. And so for me, they are not separate, independent, non-overlapping magisteria. For me, they are interconnected intimately, each with their own role and each with their own purpose, not in competition with each other, but to inform me about what is happening to this world. So what I want to do is I want to kind of walk you through the way I think about science and the way I think about faith when it comes to climate change. Why do we need science when it comes to climate change? We need science for many reasons, and here's 3 of them. Reason number 1, science tells us what's happening. How would we even know that we had a problem if it wasn't for science? We wouldn't. We know that we are already naturally vulnerable to weather and climate extremes. This is a map of the number of events that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage since 1980. And we know that we're naturally vulnerable to hurricanes, floods, heat waves, dust storms, snowstorms, blizzards, tornadoes, and more. But we also know that climate change is loading the weather dice against us. These dice started off with 2 6s on them. But now, as climate has changed, they have 3 6s, 4 6s. Now, in some places, they have a pair of 7s on them. We're starting to see that extreme heat is becoming much more frequent. This is a comparison of how many cold temperature records we break versus how many high temperature records we break. For the last decade and more, we've been breaking anywhere from 2 to 7 times more high temperature records per year. In 2017, we broke 10,000 cold temperature records, but we broke over 30,000 high temperature records. We're also seeing that heavy rainfall is increasing. Since the 1950s, heavy rainfall has increased 63% in the Midwest. Does this sound familiar? Yes, science shows us that. It tells us that atmospheric rivers, which are like water bombs that hit the west coast of North America, atmospheric rivers are getting more frequent and more severe. Hurricanes are not getting more frequent, but they're bigger and they're stronger and they're slower and they have a lot more rainfall associated with them. In fact, the science tells us that Hurricane Harvey, if the same storm had happened 100 years ago, it would have had not nearly as much precipitation. 40% of the precipitation associated with Hurricane Harvey was due to human-induced climate change. That's a big loading of the dice. Science tells us, recent headlines, that melting glaciers are causing even more sea level rise than we thought, or that the Great Barrier Reef is not healing after the damage from the last heat wave. And so 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, I was a lead author on Volume 1 of the U.S. National Climate Assessment that talks about how climate is changing, why climate is changing, and how that's affecting our temperature, precipitation, the Arctic, our oceans, our droughts, heat waves, and more. We also need science, though, to tell us why it matters. Because so far the world's warmed by 1 degree C or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, there's a bigger temperature difference between this room and the hallway outside. Why does that matter? It turns out that we obsess a lot over whether people agree with the science. And this is a map from the Yale Climate Communication Program. Anything blue is less than 50%. Anything orange is more than 50%. We tend to obsess over whether people agree with the science. But as we can see from the polling that they do, that is not the biggest problem we have, believe it or not. If you don't believe me, I will show you. So this is how many people agree that global warming is real, caused by human activities. This is the number of people who think it's happening. Now, there's a county in Utah, there's one in West Virginia, and there's one on the border of Georgia, but everything else is orange. So most people think it's happening, and then get this, do you think it will harm plants and animals? Even those counties say yes. Might not be happening, but if it is, it will harm plants and animals. Do you think it will harm future generations? Yes. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? A bit lighter, but mostly yes. Do you think it will harm people in the United States? But again, it's still a lot oranger than this, right? So do you think it will harm people in the United States? And then here's the kicker, ready? Do you think it will affect you personally? This is the real problem. So that is why it is so essential that the science not only tell us what is happening, but that the science tell us why it matters. In my mind, that's actually the more important role of science right now. And so that's what the second volume of the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which was just released this past Thanksgiving on Black Friday, that's what the second volume talks about. It talks about how on the Atlantic coast, in many small towns, nuisance or sunny day flooding, not associated with the storm, has increased tenfold since 1960s. It tells us how in Louisiana there are already climate refugees. Native American tribes who have lived on their land past memory, who are having to move and figure out what to do with their town as their land sinks. And one of the reasons why land in the Gulf area is sinking is because of the withdrawal of oil and gas and water from underground reservoirs, as well as sea level rises. Did you know that we had climate refugees in the United States? In Miami, they're raising their streets by 2 feet. This is from a real estate blog. This is not Huffington Post. Look at that. They're raising their streets by 2 feet. And as a climate scientist, I think that will help, but it will only help for a certain amount of time. Last December, the Thomas Fire broke the record for the most area burned by any wildfire in the history of the state of California. In the summer, the Ranch Fire smashed that record. And of course, this past fall, the Camp Fire blew it away. How is it that we're breaking record after record for more and more area burned? It's because wildfire is a natural part of the ecosystem in California. But without climate change, we would only have seen about 10 million acres burned since the 1980s. With climate change loading the dice against us, we've seen about 23 million acres, more than double. We know that heavy rainfall is increasing. Why do we care about heavy rainfall increasing? Because it affects us. Massive flooding. A year ago, last September, it was the monsoon season in Bangladesh. The monsoon is normal and natural. What is not normal or natural is for the monsoon to be supercharged by a warming ocean to the extent where 1/3 of the entire country was underwater. Then we've got the Midwest floods, the Nebraska floods. The same time there was floods in Indonesia. We know what these look like, and we see why they matter to us. 10 years ago, I participated in a climate change impact assessment for the Midwest, And I developed this migrating state approach where it looked like, well, what will Wisconsin actually feel like in the future in summer? And this gives us a very graphic picture. I mean, do you really want Wisconsin to feel like Arkansas? No, you don't. We talk about what's happening up in the Arctic, where what used to be permanently frozen ground is thawing and crumbling under people's homes and buildings and infrastructure and oil pipelines too. What's happening on the islands where their water supply is limited, where key infrastructure is built within a foot or two of sea level rise, where historic sites are already being inundated today. So that's what the second volume of the National Climate Assessment did. It didn't just show us what is happening, it showed us why it matters to us. And as you just saw from those polling maps, that is a lot more important, isn't it? We're starting to see this come home. The Yale program has been polling people for over 10 years, and this past January, they recorded the biggest jumps in level of concern they had ever seen in 10 years of polling. And when they asked me about it, one of the things I said is, well, I think part of it is because it's not the future anymore. It's not just plants and animals and polar bears. It's not even people in developing countries. It's us. We are seeing the impacts of climate change in the places where we live. It is starting to come home. So I want to ask you, when it comes to climate change, what concerns you the most? If you're going to use more than one word, connect your word with a dot or a dash, okay? So don't use any spaces. You can use one word, you can use multiple words, but connect them with a dot or a dash. You'll see why. Look at these words. There is Arctic, but we're not seeing polar bears. We're seeing things that matter to us, our kids, our children, our future, poverty, loss, flooding, heat, water resources, inequity, extinctions, injustice, our health. This is what we need to connect the dots between why it matters and our own values that we already care about. It isn't a matter of creating new values to care about climate change. You already have these values. We just need to connect the dots. So the last thing that we need the science for, I love this. The last thing that we need the science for, and this is what I do myself, this is what my research looks at, is to tell us what the impact of our choices will be. Because if you didn't know that smoking caused lung cancer, would you smoke? I probably would. They say it's good for the nerves. If you didn't know that eating certain types of food was bad for you, well, you'd probably eat a lot more of those foods, wouldn't you? So what I do is I'm almost sort of like the cardiologist who, does a scan of your heart, and they're like, okay, well, one artery is about 20% blocked right now, and if you continue on your current pathway, and we look at future pathways or scenarios, if you continue on your current pathway depending primarily on fossil fuels as your primary resource, the heart analogy being your current diet and your current lack of exercise, your current lifestyle, then here's where you're going to end up. But if you take my warning to heart and you change your lifestyle and you eat more healthily and you exercise more and you change the way you get your energy, then you could end up in a very different place. And I show people the difference between these. We can show people the difference for different complicated scenarios with very long names, but what I prefer to do is to show people the difference between different levels of global temperature change. So if the world gets warmer by 2, 3, 4 degrees, science can tell us, here's how much carbon we can produce to give us a chance of staying below 2, 3, or 4 degrees. That's what the science can tell us. And then from National Academy reports like this one to the IPCC 1.5 degree report that just came out in October, we can actually chart the impacts of a changing climate on things that matter to us, like what? Like crop yields. These are the 5 biggest crops in the world. This axis is not time, it's global temperature. So what this shows us is, what if your primary concern is wheat in India? That's the purple line. Then what would you say is a dangerous level of warming? Because by the time it's at 1 degree, you're looking at about a 5% decrease. By the time you're at 2 degrees, you're looking at over a 20% decrease. By the time you're at 3 degrees, you're looking at a 50% decrease in wheat yield in India. So if your concern is about that, you would say, wow, even 2 degrees actually looks like too much for me. But if your concern was rice in Asia, well, rice in Asia actually looks fine at 2 degrees. But once you start to go past 3 and 4, then rice in Asia starts to drop. So science can tell us what happens to specific crops as temperature changes. Science can tell us per degree of warming what happens to our runoff, our water resources in all of the major basins across the United States. Science can answer these questions of what happens depending on the choices that we make, but science can't tell us what's the right choice. So in 1992, every country in the world went to Rio and signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as the UNFCCC. And the big climate conferences that happen in Poland this past year, in Paris 3 years ago, actually last time I was here was just before I went to the Paris conference, they're actually known as the Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC. Nobody like policymakers to really pile on the acronyms. So at that conference, every nation in the world, including the US, agreed to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So us scientists can tell you to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations, you need net zero emissions. In other words, if you still produce any carbon, you have to suck up just as much. We can tell you that at a level that would prevent dangerous human, anthropogenic is human, interference with the climate system. What's dangerous? That's not a scientific question. It isn't. Because remember what we just looked at here? If your perspective is Asian rice, 2 degrees might not look so dangerous. If your perspective is Indian wheat, 2 degrees is way too dangerous. This is not a scientific question anymore. And so in Paris, when the world agreed in Paris, and this is the Paris Agreement, when they agreed to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees, this is a decision that was made informed by science based on values. Because what's dangerous is a value choice. So here's where our heart comes in. When science gives us difficult, thorny decisions to make, we need our values to inform that decision. We have to assess what type of risk is acceptable, what is not, what is dangerous, what can we cope with. And for the vast majority of us around the world, over 85% of us, I believe, around the world, our values are typically informed by our faith. Now, you might say, but hang on, Catherine. When you ask people how concerned you are about a changing climate, I know what type of answer you get. If you divide people's answers out not by geography, if you divide them out by religious affiliation, who's at the bottom? Surprise, it's not white evangelicals. We got beat out by white Catholics by 1 percentage point. So people say, well, you say you need your values, but it's your values that are causing you to reject the reality of climate change. Because it often seems that way. Why? Let's just take a little trip down memory lane if we've forgotten. This, and this. So people say, well, it's your very Christian values that cause you to reject the reality of a changing climate, so how can you say you need that? Well, what I want to do is I want to highlight something for you here. So we've got white Catholics there with white evangelicals pretty much neck and neck at the bottom. But who is the most concerned people group about climate change in the United States? Hispanic Catholics. Hang on a second, do they not have the same Pope? And did that Pope not write this giant, thick book called an encyclical all about climate change and how it affects the poor and connecting it to Christian values? Yes, he did. So this is where we start to figure out that it is not our Christian values driving our opinion. And in fact, when the Pope's encyclical came out, a lot of people wondered what impact it would have on people's opinion of climate change. And why I love social science so much is because they actually answer these questions. So this is my friend and colleague, Ashley. And she actually studied and presented at AAAS last year the results of the Pope's encyclical on public opinion. And what she found, I will paraphrase this for you, what she found is that it wasn't so much that the encyclical changed people's opinions about climate change, the encyclical changed people's opinions about the Pope. So Christians, Protestant and Catholic, who already agreed that climate change was real, their opinion of the Pope went up after the encyclical. The Pope was more popular. But for Catholics who disagreed with what the Pope said, their opinion of the Pope went down. In fact, their response was what you hear a lot of in Texas: "Oh, bless his heart." He means well, but he just does not know. So a few years earlier, John Evans, another social scientist, had actually dug into this. He said, we know that conservative Protestants, he looked only at Protestants, are less likely to believe the conclusiveness of climate science, but controlling for demographic properties show it's not where they go to church or not that is actually the controlling factor. It's the fact that they are very politically conservative and their faith has become associated with the right-hand side of the political spectrum over the last 40 to 50 years. And in fact, Galen Carey from the National Association of Evangelicals put it even more clearly. He said, many evangelicals oppose action to slow climate change, not on a religious basis, but politically, because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. So when I said that we need our faith, we need our values, and for those of us who come from a faith background, our values are informed by our faith, when I said that we need our values to figure out what to do, I was not joking. I was very serious. Because what do our values actually say? Well, if we are Christians, then we look to the Bible to see what our values are. So let's look at what it says. Now, there's no verse that says climate change is real in the Bible. The words climate and change don't even occur together in the Bible at all. But there's a lot of verses about attitudes and actions, and it starts in Genesis 1. This is a verse that every child learns in Sunday school, if they attend Sunday school, that God made humans in his image. But I never went to a single class or talk or lesson of anything that talked about the so that. Why? I was never told why. I never heard a single talk about why we were made in God's image. Well, it's not a mystery. You just keep reading. And it says, let us make human beings in our image so that they can be responsible for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. That was why. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So this has led to the concept of stewardship, the idea that if somebody who you loved and respected more than anyone in the world gave you a piece of land and you pulled every single penny out of that land and left it a cracked and deserted ruin, what would that say about your perspective to the person who gave it to you? Whereas if you take that land and you farm it and you till it, and you make sure that you have good carbon sequestration processes in place, and you grow, you have sustainable agriculture and free-range animals, and you make sure that there's jobs for people there, that it supports people and plants and animals. That's the concept of being a good steward. And the idea of being a good steward is throughout the entire Bible. A verse in Corinthians talked about to those who have been given a trust, we should be faithful to that trust. Each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards. So this is a concept that runs throughout the whole Bible, and it has led to the concept of creation care. But this is an imperfect and incomplete perspective from the Bible. Because creation care assumes, well, we are caring for creation as if somehow we're not part of it. And today we know with nearly 8 billion people in the world, we are very much part of the living things on this planet, right? Not only are we very much part of the living things, but we are also one of the species that is suffering the most from issues like poverty and hunger and disease. This is a map showing the percentage of people who live in desperate poverty in each of these countries. And when we overlay this map with a different map of who is most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate, the connection is immediate. So for me, growing up in a country where people live on the edge, where when disaster strikes, there is no insurance, there is no FEMA, there is no National Guard. They do send the military police to help them out, but it's mostly to carry the bodies away. I could see that immediate connection. The fact that climate change is a threat multiplier that takes hunger, takes lack of access to clean water, it takes people dying of diseases that nobody should die from in 2019, and it exacerbates them. Climate change is the hole in the bucket. We're pouring all of our effort and time and money and prayers into this bucket to try to fix the massive problems that are killing people today and causing untold suffering, and climate change is the hole in the bucket. So as a Christian and as a human, we care about a changing climate because it affects real people today. And when we go to the Bible, it isn't just about caring for creation or being good stewards. It is about walking in love, thinking of others before ourselves. Or as they say again in the very concise Texas version of the Bible, which is published on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, sign God. The Bible actually tells us, believe it or not, that our defining characteristic is to be loving other people. You can kind of see where that conversation I started off with came from, right? How he said, well, I didn't really have a problem with the Bible, I had a problem with people. Our defining characteristic is to love other people. So why do I care about a changing climate? Because God has made us responsible, I believe, for every living thing, which includes people, and because it affects real people today, especially those who are poor and vulnerable, who did the least to contribute to this problem. So what else does my faith tell me? My faith also helps me with how to respond. Because when we're confronted with this overwhelming issue of climate change, our first response is often fear. We're presented with apocalyptic visions of what the world will look like if climate change continues unchecked. We are also presented with apocalyptic visions of what the world will look like if we fix it. The economy will be destroyed. Nobody can drive or have any water or eat any meat or travel. So we're faced with competing apocalyptic visions of the world, and it just makes us want to pull the blankets up over our head. Often our defense mechanism is just to shut off because there's only so much bad news we can absorb, especially if we feel like we're only one person who can't fix it on our own. But what the Bible tells me is that we are not to respond out of fear or out of guilt, but out of love and hope. And there's actually a verse about this. One of my favorite verses is that God hasn't given us a spirit of fear. So when I experience fear, my litmus test is that is not from God. What God has given us are three tremendous gifts. A spirit of power. What does power do? It empowers us to act. What does fear do? It paralyzes us. It might help us run just fast enough to get away from the bear, but long-term fear is a paralyzing emotion. God has given us power to act, love to care for others more than ourselves and have compassion on those who are suffering, and, as a scientist, my favorite one, a sound mind to make good decisions, using the data and the information that science gives us. So let me ask you this. I want to ask you, give me a word, or you can join the words together. What gives you hope? What gives you hope? If you're going to use multiple words, make sure you connect them with a dash or a dot. But I want to hear your story, because one of the biggest ways that I get hope is from having conversations with other people and hearing from them. Really interesting things that are happening or that they're doing or something that somebody else did. To know that I'm not alone, that we're all acting together. So, what gives us hope? I am not surprised to see kids, youth, Greta, children, and people here. I am not surprised at all. In fact, there's a there's been some conversations lately about, should I have children because of climate change? Because every additional human carries an additional carbon footprint. And my answer when I was asked that is, without children, we have no hope. If you've ever seen a movie called Children of Men, where nobody can have children anymore, it is the most hopeless, despairing world. Now, we don't need to go out and have 12 children. You know, the commandment to, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, accomplished, check. Done that. But without children, why would I be motivated to change the world? So I love that I'm seeing this come out, and we're also seeing faith, compassion, Jesus, God, wisdom. Technology, technology gives me hope. I love hearing about new technology, I really do. And I love seeing very specific things there too. Fantastic. So I have a perspective on hope that I get it from talking to other people, but in the Bible, it also talks about hope, and it talks about it in a really unusual way. So here's what it says in Romans 5. It says, suffering. It starts with suffering. Suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint. Isn't that a bit of a different order than you'd think? So hope is something that we can grow. And I have shared with you from my own heart what I believe. But a few years ago, I was asked by the American Geophysical Union, our scientific society, to host a blog for Faith and Climate Week, talking about how our faith informs the science that we do. And so what I did was I went and I collected a few different colleagues. I wrote a paragraph from a Protestant perspective. I had a colleague write a paragraph from a Catholic perspective. I had Asma write a paragraph from a Muslim perspective. And she wrote about how, as a scientist and a person of faith, she's always felt the calling, a calling towards obligation to justice, which is really what climate change is all about. And she quoted from the Quran about how we've been appointed guardians of the earth. Exact same concept, totally different words, identical concept. And then my friend and colleague Vaishali, who's Hindu, she wrote about the concepts of dharma and the concepts of karma, and the idea of doing our part to care for and treat with respect every aspect of living things on earth. Totally different words, exact same concept. And then at an AGU meeting, I had a colleague email me ahead of time and say, I'd like to meet with you. And usually I meet with colleagues to talk about research projects or things like that, and I didn't have anything going on with him at the moment, but I said, sure, I'd love to have lunch with you. So I walked in, and I sat down at the table, and he leaned across the table to me, and he said, I'm a humanist, but I care about climate change too. I said, well, of course you do. And he said, I care about people. I care that it is profoundly unfair. It affects people who have done nothing to contribute to the problem. And that is why I'm doing everything I can, not just to study the science, but to study the solutions too, because I'm a humanist. All we have to be is a human to care about climate change, because we care about our brothers and sisters here and around the world. What unites us is far more than what divides us today. And so caring about climate change is a profoundly human thing. So to close with the words of one of my favorite scientists, Jane Goodall, after a long career in science, she said this only a few years ago. She said, it is only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential. So when I talk about climate change, not just the science, but the solutions and our attitudes towards them, my favorite title is this. Thank you.